Yeah, thank you. So pretty much already been introduced, but yeah, I'm a master's student at Cal State Fullerton. I spent most of my time in the master's program studying psychology from an evolutionary perspective. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means before I get into more of the details about my talk. But broadly, my talk is going to be about the importance of formidability in the past, and then what that means for modern psychology, modern behavior, so why formidability is still important now. But I'll start with an example. So who do you think should win this fight? Anybody? The right or the left? Bowser or Mario? Probably, I mean, maybe we've played the game so we just think Mario would win. But Bowser should win more often than Mario does, just because he is a stronger, larger, just more scary individual than Mario is, right? That might not be the case for when you play, but I don't think I ever made it past that level. And then how about in this fight? Does anybody have any intuitions about who should be winning this fight? Right or left? Okay, so again, this guy who looks generally bigger, stronger than the guy on the left, even though there's not a huge discrepancy, we might have an intuition that he might win. So on average, in both of these situations and across situations where two people are pitted against each other, we have this general intuition that more formidable people tend to win fights. So formidability, I'm defining it as an increased ability to impose physical costs on other people, and that might not really help you understand what formidability is. So really, formidability to me is strength, fighting ability, toughness, body size. Just anything that makes you a general badass when it comes to fighting, you're more formidable than somebody who doesn't have those traits. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. So in this talk, I'm going to argue that formidability was an important dimension of ancestral fitness, and as a result, still influences our modern behavior. And so hopefully I can convince you of this by the end of the talk, and you'll know why I think this. So here's a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about, right? So I'm going to talk about the past. Why was formidability important, and was it important? So I'll go through the theoretical background, where I'm coming from with these ideas. I'm going to talk about existing evidence that supports the idea that formidability was important. And then I'll mention some predictions about modern behavior and psychology that come from the importance of formidability. And then I'll talk about why formidability matters now, and why it might still matter. And I'll give you guys some evidence that it does still matter, so some situations, some studies that have shown that it still matters to some extent. And then I'll talk about some future lines of inquiry. So for the theoretical background, like I said, I'm coming from the field of evolutionary psychology. And an evolutionary psychologist essentially thinks that the mind is a product of evolution by natural selection, just like our bodies and all living organisms were designed through the process of natural selection, so too is our mind. And then because of that, modern behavior and psychology can be explained by the past, which in evolutionary psychology is called the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or the EEA, which is just a fancy way of saying all of the environments that human ancestors have lived in over the course of evolutionary history, and all of the problems and challenges that those environments posed on us. So the average of all of those is the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. And further, a belief of evolutionary psychology is that the mind should be designed to guide adaptive behavior, but then this idea of adaptive doesn't necessarily mean that it's adaptive in the modern world, right? And a classic example of this is the sweet tooth. So how many of us like candy, sweet things, fruit, or fatty foods too also counts? Probably most of us have at least some craving for these things, right? And this is an adaptation to seek out high-density caloric packages that have good nutritional value, which are things like fruit, which are sweet, and then fatty foods like meats, nuts. We learned in the last talk, right, that sugars and lipids are super important for cellular development and growth. So that's an adaptation to seek out these things that we need to get from the environment. But that's not adaptive in the modern world because we have things like Halloween and donuts and fast food shops in every corner. So we have access to these things all the time, even though in the past they were rare. So we should have been motivated to seek them out. Now they're just everywhere, and that leads to maladaptive behaviors like obesity, diabetes, etc. Does that make sense? Another tenet of evolutionary psychology is that emotions are for guiding behavior. So we don't just have emotions because we like to feel things. Emotions have an adaptive function. So an example of this would be fear. When do we feel fear? Does anybody have, just chime out when we feel fear? Anybody? Yeah, okay. So things that, more generally maybe, it's things that would pose a threat to you and essentially your reproductive success in the future. So for example, if you're walking through the forest and you see a bear, that bear can harm you, kill you, which essentially nullifies your reproductive contribution. So fear motivates you to get away from a threat, to get away from that bear. And another emotion that's going to be important for this talk is anger. Maybe you can think about why anger might be, or what the adaptive function of anger might be, and I'll go into that later, but maybe you can just think about it for now. All right. Another foundational theory that is incorporated into my research is the logic of animal conflict. And this is a classic concept in evolutionary biology that basically demonstrates how aggressive behavior could have evolved and be maintained across the animal kingdom. So the first part of it is that organisms compete for access to resources, and physical violence is a form of competition, right? So if you're going to compete, one viable option of competing is physical competition. And then physical competition, while it has high rewards, meaning you can get things that you want and prevent other people from taking things that you want, it also has high potential costs if you're not able to implement aggression effectively. So if you're not a very formidable organism and you try to use aggression against a more formidable organism, you're probably not going to be successful, right? So then you're going to likely suffer cost of aggression, which could be injury, loss of resources, or even death. So these are things that if you're an organism trying to reproduce your genes, that's not good. And as we've already kind of demonstrated to ourselves earlier with those two pictures, asymmetries and formidability, so asymmetries and things that lead to better fighting success, predict the outcome of physical conflict. And that's pretty straightforward. In general, animals that are more formidable are more likely to win contests, physical contests. And as you might already be thinking, it seems like this talk is going to be mostly focused on men, and that is true. But there's a good reason for that. Another theory, or part of evolutionary theory, is sexual selection. We all know about natural selection, right? But sexual selection is another important theory, often called Darwin's other theory. And that relates to formidability in several important ways. So first, there's an asymmetry in parental investment between the sexes. So women invest far more in offspring than men do, if nothing else, because they have to carry something inside them for 9 months before their reproductive success is worthwhile, whereas men don't have to invest anything other than this initial sperm, right? But there's also an asymmetry in reproductive rate. So men have a higher reproductive potential than women do. Women have a limited number of eggs, and then also any time that you are pregnant, you can't be pregnant in that time, and even for years afterwards because of breastfeeding and raising children. Whereas men can have, really in theory, men can impregnate a different woman like every day, right? That's not the case, thankfully, but there's way higher potential for men to have more reproductive success than women do. And this means that at any given point in time, there are more men seeking to reproduce than there are fertile women, because even if some women are pregnant, then that means that they're not viable options for reproduction for men. So already there's an imbalance in the amount of men competing for access to a limited number of women. And this means that men have to compete for access to women, right? And as I mentioned before, one form of competition is physical competition. And this is why formidability should be important, but only really in men. So if it mattered at all in the past, it would have mattered for men. So we've established why formidability might be important, but we also need to show that physical conflict would have been common in the evolutionary past for humans, right? Because otherwise, my ideas don't really stand. So was it common in human evolution? Probably yes. We're going to go into some evidence from the animal kingdom. So because of evolutionary theory, we can look to other animals, other species, to see how common traits are spread out across the animal kingdom. And we can make inferences about our own evolution because of that. So aggressive behavior is extremely common throughout the animal kingdom. Even in crickets and fish, they compete aggressively for access to resources and mates. And in our closest primate relatives, chimps, they are super violent and they compete for places in social dominance hierarchies, which gives them access to resources and mates. So this is all evidence either that we have a common ancestor, which we all do, right, that used aggressive behavior to gain access to resources, or that aggressive behavior is such an efficient way to gain access to resources that it evolved in different lineages over the course of evolutionary history. And this together suggests that it's likely that human ancestors also were violent to some extent and competed physically for access to resources. But if that's not enough for you, there's also a lot of evidence in the historical and archaeological record. So this is the oldest known instance of probable homicide. This skull is 430,000 years old, and the scientists that found it were able to use computer models to recreate how the blow to the head must have came from somebody else, and it led to this person's death. So this is one example of evidence for violent conflict throughout human history. And then there's more evidence. More recently, this is a skull from a mass burial site from some battle that happened 10,000 years ago. And then, of course, in more recent history, we have like medieval lords and knights just competing for access to resources and expanding their feudal lands for almost no reason other than status and, of course, to gain access to more resources. And then even in ancient Americas, even though we have this idea of like noble savages is what it's called, it's not necessarily the case that people who are living in small-scale societies are just peaceful. A lot of times there is a lot of violence and intergroup conflict, which would make aggression very common. And here's some more evidence, another mass burial site in New Mexico. And then, of course, there's some cave paintings depicting warfare between groups of people. So all this is just to say that there is evidence that aggression and violence was common in the evolutionary past. But this is probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the actual frequency of aggressive conflict, just because of the way the skeletal or the fossil record works and historical record. We don't know everything, and we probably won't. But we also have evidence from contemporary traditional societies, which are things like small-scale hunter-gatherer societies, forager societies, which we use as models to understand more about human evolution and the social structures that were likely in place in the evolutionary past. And in these societies, if you're a male in this society, you have a 30% chance of dying from violent conflict with other males, which I don't know if maybe you guys are appreciating what that means, but if you think about what the homicide rate is in America, this is for both sexes, is 8%. So you have a much higher chance of dying in one of these societies just because you're a male from violent conflict. And Another way to maybe understand how big of a number this is to think about the transfer rate from a community college to a four-year college is lower at most institutions than this. So that's another scary thing. And then this is actually like an average lower number, right? So in some societies, the chances of dying from violent conflict if you're a male is as high as 59%, like in the Achuar, in the Canambo, which is in Ecuador, in South America. So basically, if you grow up in that society and you're a male, you can basically flip a coin whether or not you're going to make it through adulthood without dying from violent conflict. So we don't have to deal with that here. But it gives us hints that maybe aggressive conflict was likely a common component of small-scale societies in the past. And in these small-scale societies, formidability is beneficial in several ways. For example, more formidable men tend to have increased reproductive success. They have more children, and their children tend to live more often. And then there's lower likelihood of death by contact violence. So if you're more formidable, you're less likely to die in one of these societies. And there's also some evidence, but it's not very strong, that more formidable men are more likely to be leaders in these societies, and leaders tend to get more rewards and benefits from being leaders than non-leaders. So because natural selection acts on asymmetries in formidability, then we should see this borne out in our anatomy. So one of the biggest sex differences between men and women is the difference between formidability. For example, men have 90% more upper body strength than women on average. And this translates to like 77% more force exerted by the upper body. And this is a huge sex difference. I don't know if you guys know Cohen's d. Basically, this is a Cohen's d of 0.3, or of 3, not 0.3, which is huge. This is kind of what that looks like. I don't know if you guys can really see the green dots very well. But the blue dots up at the top are men's grip strength, and this is a nationally representative sample in America. And the green dots at the bottom are women's grip strength. And you can see that you have to be one of the most formidable women, have one of the highest grip strengths, to come up close to the mean grip strength for men. And there's also more variation in the grip strength of men. So this is just showing you how sexually dimorphic strength is. And this is because men would have had to compete more often in the evolutionary past for access to resources and mates. There's also some other potential adaptations for fighting. So men have nearly double the skeletal density of women by the end of puberty. Men tend to be more resistant to concussions. And there's also evidence that the way we make fists is to essentially protect our fingers from breaking when we hit things. And then that our face is designed in such a way to protect things like your brain from trauma in fights. But of course, not all men look like crazy fighting machines. I'm definitely not a crazy fighting machine. So this just highlights that formidability, tracking formidability, and any information about formidability would have been important because that would have affected your ability to gain access to resources and mates in the past. So hopefully by now, we all kind of somewhat agree that formidability would have been important in the past just because aggressive and violent conflict was so common. But why would that still matter today, right? In our modern society, most of us don't use aggression, especially physical aggression, to get what we want, right? And in fact, it's frowned upon in our society. So when I say it still matters, I don't mean that it still matters because if you're more aggressive, you can get more of what you want. I'm saying it matters because in the past it matters, and that affects the way our brain thinks about this thing, formidability, and that's why it still matters today, because it impacts our social interactions with other people and our societal structure and other things I'll talk about now. Yeah, so I just said this, but formidability still matters because brains evolved in a time when it mattered. So brains pay attention to formidability, and then they use that information about formidability to guide behavior. And this is probably done through some sort of cognitive mechanism. And we know that cognitive mechanisms evolve in response to selection pressures. So aggression was the selection pressure. Knowing when to use aggression was the selection pressure. Basically, knowing when you should be competing for things physically would have been a selection pressure. So we should have some kind of cognitive mechanism that's designed to monitor formidability in the environment, and then also incorporate information about formidability into the decisions that we make and our behavior. So next I'll talk about how some of these cognitive mechanisms might take in formidability, right, and use it to guide behavior output. So there is quite a bit of evidence that we can monitor formidability and that we do. Here's the first bit of evidence. So in this study, they showed pictures of men's bodies and pictures of men's faces to people who rated their strength on like a 1 to 7 scale. And the researchers had the people in the photos, they had their actual strength measures, which they measured using weightlifting machines and grip strength, and they measured bicep circumference and all these things. And people's ratings of the formidability of the men in the pictures accurately tracked their actual strength. And maybe you're thinking, well, so what? But that's a surprisingly difficult task. We take it for granted because we're humans. We just see this every day and we do it without thinking about it. But it's difficult to look at something and tell how strong it is if you didn't have this psychology to do so. And this applied in multiple different samples of college students, but college students were also able to accurately assess the strength of people from hunter-gatherer societies and societies that weren't America, basically. So it shows that the cues of formidability are constant somewhat across cultures. And another surprising thing about some of this research is that we could track formidability accurately just from the voice. So hearing somebody's voice, we can assess their strength. And you can see that's the white bar on the far left, or all the white bars are all tracking strength, and it's not that far off from actually seeing somebody. So of these two men, who do you think would win in a fight? Right or the left? Who thinks right? You can raise your hand. Who thinks left? Okay, I can't really tell if it's evenly split. But the man on the right is a composite image of people who have been in the UFC for a long time and have won a lot of fights, and the composite image of the left is people who have been around the UFC but haven't won a lot of fights. So we're judging, and in this study, respondents did judge accurately that the man on the right was more likely to win in a fight. And so this suggests that we're tracking some kind of cues from the face, right? And they manipulated facial width to height ratio, which is basically just the width of your height divided by, or the width of your face divided by the height of your face. And they found that men with higher width to height ratio, so men with wider faces compared to taller faces, were perceived as more dominant, more aggressive, and more likely to win fights. So we're tracking these cues just from the face, and that might be one cue that we use. And this is some pilot data that I collected a couple years ago. So because we can assess these cues, we should be doing it in everyday life because formidability is so important. So I just asked men and women, if you meet somebody of the same sex for the first time, how likely are you to think about their strength? And yeah, this is the results. So women were far less likely than men to report thinking about this, and men were more likely to report thinking about it somewhat. But this isn't very good evidence for it because these assessments are likely not conscious. I don't walk around going like, I could beat that guy up, I could beat that guy up, I don't think I could beat that guy up. But my brain is probably doing something similar without me even being aware of it and then influencing my behavior. So currently I'm working on another study, which I'll go into more at the end. But this is just to highlight more about the cue structure. So I'm using an eye tracker and replicating that first study that I told you about, where I just show people pictures of other men, and I have their actual strength measurements, and I get ratings of strength from different people. But I'm tracking their eyes, where they look while they make these ratings. And you can see that people are looking more at the upper body, especially like the chest area, and a lot less of the face. And that could just be because the upper body is a more important cue of upper body strength. So pretty self-explanatory. But this is just preliminary data. And all 68 images tend to have pretty much the same pattern. And these heat maps are based on 78 people so far. But I mean, it's probably not going to change a lot. So we've kind of already talked about this. Why would we collect information about formidability is because it's really important. But also, by collecting information about formidability, you're learning about your own formidability relative to other people in your environment. And this should be important for calibrating or guiding behavior. So a lot of research has been done on this. But first, let's remember that emotions are programs designed to motivate behaviors, right? So we talked about fear, and I asked you guys to maybe think about anger, but I mean, maybe you didn't. So we're going to talk about the adaptive function of anger now. And this was, the logic of this was laid out by Ancestral, who's one of the basically pioneers of this area of research, dealing with how formidability matters for behavior. So in his paper, he talks about welfare trade-off ratios, or WTRs, which are essentially just the value that somebody else places on your well-being compared to the value that you place on your well-being, right? So you should have, hopefully, you have a fairly high value on your own well-being. And if others also have a similar value of your well-being, then they have a high welfare trade-off ratio towards you. But if somebody doesn't have a high welfare trade-off ratio towards you, meaning that they don't place very much value on your well-being, and you realize that or you perceive that, then that might incite anger in you. And in this paper, Ancestral talks about how anger is then used to incite some kind of behavior that will correct the future, first of all, correct the imbalance in the welfare trade-off ratio to try and raise their welfare trade-off ratio towards you now and then also in the future. So anger is used to incite aggression, which is a form of cost imposition to correct these welfare trade-off ratios. And hopefully, the anger itself, so in the last talk he mentioned things like blushing, but people also tend to get red-faced when they're angry, right? So that's a signal to others that you're angry, and if they recognize that you're a formidable individual, then hopefully that's enough to correct their welfare trade-off ratio. But it's that threat of aggression and then the ability to back up that aggression that makes the signal of anger a viable signal to other people that they should change their welfare trade-off ratio towards you. So maybe it's better if I explain the welfare trade-off ratio as basically you use anger to be like, you better check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? So yeah. And I've mentioned how if you're more formidable, then aggression is a more viable option for you. But that means that less formidable individuals shouldn't get angry as easily as more formidable individuals. And that's what this study found. Formidability was positively correlated with, first of all, anger, and then also aggressive behavior. And then after this study, several other studies have looked at that relationship, and there's been mixed results. So what I did a meta-analysis of this relationship. So I took all the studies that have been done on it, and I just found the average effect size. And it's a pretty small effect size, but the relationship is there, and it's significant. And this is based on 9,925 people. So this is really good evidence that, yeah, more formidable people are more aggressive on average than less formidable people. But that was considering all kinds of formidability. So that was things like height, weight, BMI, actual strength, self-perceived strength. So when I broke it apart by categories, we saw that self-perceived formidability was a much better predictor of physical aggression. So how formidable you think of yourself as being, that's a better indicator of how aggressive you're going to be. And it's actually, in this case, it's a better indicator than actual strength, which might seem somewhat counterintuitive. But if we think about how aggressive behavior is calibrated, it's calibrated to your relative formidability people in your environment, right? So just because you're strong doesn't mean that the people around you aren't also strong. But if you have a high self-perceived formidability, it probably indicates that you're more formidable than the people that you're around most often. So self-perceptions are likely important behavioral inputs or inputs for behavioral outputs. And this similar logic has been extended to other forms of behaviors and opinions and beliefs. So first of all, formidability is associated with political attitudes and belief in the utility of warfare. So what this means is that more formidable men tend to agree more with statements like if one country has resources that another country wants, it's okay for that other country to go in and take those resources through physical coercion. And then also in this study, they looked at Hollywood movie stars, basically. So Hollywood is a pretty liberal place on average. But when action stars, who tend to be more formidable, are taller, they are more likely to identify as Republicans than, say, comedy stars, who don't tend to be aggressive and formidable, who tend to be Democratic. And this is just kind of like an extreme example of how this might play out in the real world, but that's a weird kind of population anyway. But this was kind of replicated conceptually in another study. So your formidability also predicts your position on wealth redistribution. So you might think that it's obvious that, yeah, more formidable men are against wealth redistribution because they want to keep things that they have. But it's actually more complicated than that because men who have a lot of resources, so men who are high SES and are also more formidable, are against wealth redistribution, whereas formidable men who are low in SES, so who have not a lot of resources, are in favor of wealth redistribution. And this matters because these are the extreme positions, and people who are less formidable just tend to be more in the middle of these two positions, at least in this study. And then also, formidability is linked to how others perceive you as a leader. So if you're a formidable person, then others tend to perceive you as a better leader. And this doesn't make any sense in the modern world, right? Our leadership ability isn't tied to your formidability in the modern world. But in the past, when you wanted your leader to be able to enforce group rules and then represent you in between other groups, you want somebody who can inflict costs on people without much effort. So in this study, they asked men and women to look at these pictures and then of other men and rate how willing you would be to elect this person as somebody to enforce group rules and somebody to enforce or somebody to represent your group to another group. And they found that more formidable men were more likely to be endorsed or elected than less formidable men. And a similar study, kind of relevant to today, suggests that more formidable people actually tend to win elections in the real world, and that height and differences in height actually track the difference in the votes for each candidate. So that might be kind of terrifying, or not terrifying, depending on what I'll let you make your own decisions about that. Also, extroversion is related to formidability. So there's been a lot of work recently about how personality might relate to physical characteristics. And there's a lot of support for this idea that more formidable people tend to be more extroverted. And this makes sense in the light of the fact that extroversion means that you're going to try to interact with more people. But by doing so, you're running a higher chance that you're also going to have conflict with other people, that you're going to be exposed to pathogens, and that you're going to have to use aggression, or you're going to have to use something to win conflicts with other people. And because more formidable people are more likely to win conflicts, extroversion is a more viable option for them. And then really recently, this past year, there's been some evidence that more formidable men are less likely to have depressive symptoms and less likely to be depressed. So if you remember that graph that I showed you earlier with grip strength, this is from that study, and they found that more formidable men were less likely to experience depression. And this could be because So formidability is one way to coerce others, basically, right? If you feel like somebody's not valuing you enough, then you can use aggression to be like, hey, don't do that. In the future, you need to value me more, or else I'm going to impose these costs on you, right? But depression might be used as a way to withdraw benefits. So if you're not very formidable compared to other people, but you're contributing to the group in some way, but you feel like people aren't appreciating that, then depression, from a reductionist adaptationist perspective, allows you to withdraw all the benefits that you've been contributing to that group, and that imposes a cost on them through benefit withdrawal. So hopefully they realize, hey, we don't want this person to withdraw their benefits, and they do things to show you that they value you, which hopefully corrects or improves your depressive symptoms. And this difference in formidability basically explains the sex difference between men and women in likelihood of depression. So women are more likely to be depressed than men, but once you put in grip strength into a model predicting depression from gender, it just sucks out gender and there's no more. It's all completely mediated by grip strength. So these associations don't make a lot of sense on their face. They only make sense from some kind of evolutionary or adaptationist perspective. And that means that there must be some kind of mechanism designed to calibrate your aggressiveness to your formidability or other characteristics to your formidability. And this has been called facultative calibration, or if you're fancy, it's called Bayesian updating. And essentially, it's just saying that behavioral tendencies are calibrated to phenotypic features based on cost-benefit trade-offs. And that might make no sense to you. So behavioral tendencies are things like aggressive behavior, right, or anger. And if you are if you're aggressive across most contexts and most situations, then that's basically a personality trait about you. So, and then phenotypic features are things like attractiveness, formidability, so strength, height, weight. And then it's calibrated, those two things are calibrated based on how likely you are to benefit from certain behaviors and how likely you are to suffer costs from certain behaviors. So, yeah. And then this is likely the result of some kind of cognitive mechanism designed to take input from the environment and modulate behavior accordingly. So I've talked a lot about this already, but we're taking input, in this case, about formidability in the environment, and that regulates our behavior. So because I recognize that I'm not a very formidable person, I don't pursue aggressive strategies. I might compete less with other people, but and my advisor has a similar line of research suggesting that, like, oh, well, going through puberty is when we start to see these differences in formidability, right? So some men have crazy growth spurts in puberty and all of a sudden can pack on a bunch of muscle, and some men can't. We might see these differences in interest in things like sports, which is basically contest, competition. Also things like guns, yeah. And then more from women, we might see more interest in other lines of competition, because you can compete, as the last speaker talked about, you can compete through art and poetry and intellectual contributions and stuff like that. So all this is just to say that formidability matters today because cognitive programs designed throughout human evolution are still guiding our behavior. So because formidability mattered in the past, it matters, or we have these mechanisms designed to assess formidability and then guide our behavior from that. And even though the societal structure has changed in the modern world, where we have sanctions against aggression, these things are still guiding our behavior. So there's a lot of potential for future directions in these lines of inquiry. For example, we might explore some other behavior physical trait associations. I haven't really talked about this, but formidability is one component of a larger construct called bargaining power, and some other So bargaining power is just your ability to coerce others through cost imposition or with the withdrawal of benefits. So one example of this might be attractiveness, formidability, which we talked about, or intelligence, and there's other ones too. But I'm focusing on these three things right now, and I'm making a scale, which is just an instrument to measure people's self-perception, so basically a survey, to get an idea of how people think their own attractiveness, formidability, or intelligence are compared to others. And I'm planning to look at the relationship with more behavioral states and traits. So it might be the case that all these things that are bargaining power relate to anger in the same way that formidability relates to anger. So if you're more attractive, maybe you also are angry more easily because you have more benefits to withdraw from people if they make you angry. And same thing with intelligence. And then I want to see how accurate this measure might be. So I'm collecting information about people's actual grip strength. I'm taking pictures of people who do the attractiveness scale, and then I'm going to have other people rate their attractiveness because that's the most objective measure we have of your attractiveness is how other people think. And then I might have something like an intelligence task and correlate that with their self-perceived intelligence. And I'm interested in looking at how, first of all, how accurate they are, but also how differences in accuracy. So maybe if you're over-perceiving your intelligence, it's because there isn't a lot of costs to over-perceiving your intelligence. If you think that you're smarter than you are, that might not really affect how you interact with other people, but it might actually motivate you to pursue more things in work harder or something like that. Whereas formidability, if you think you're more aggressive or more formidable than you actually are, and then that tells you to be aggressive, then you're more likely to suffer costs because you're not actually as formidable as you think you are. So that one should be pretty accurate because there's higher costs. I'm also interested in exploring the influence of context. So I mentioned how your perception of your own formidability should be calibrated towards your environment, so how formidable other people in your environment are. So it'd be interesting if we could manipulate group makeup, so make you suddenly a very intelligent person within your group, and see if now maybe you take the lead more often because you feel like you have more to contribute, and if that might make you also feel more entitled to any benefits that your group generates. And then I'm also hoping to explore how these assessments are made. So I talked earlier about some existing research suggesting that we can assess these things, but there's not a lot of evidence about how quickly these assessments happen, what other cues we use, and how quickly our mind attends to these things. So for my thesis, I'm looking at something called spontaneous assessments of formidability. And so in the past, people have presented pictures and been like, how strong is this person? So I'm going to be presenting pictures without asking those things, but then later on, asking them to recall. So that would demonstrate that people encoded information about formidability. And I'm also, one task within my study is I'm flashing pictures really quickly at people and seeing how fast we can make these judgments of formidability. So how much information, how long do we need to be exposed to the information? And it looks like so far that we don't even need a full second to be able to assess how formidable or how strong somebody is. And I'm also looking at some hypothesis related to how sticky formidability is. So because it's so important, we should be paying attention to it, and it should capture our attention. So I have a task designed to do that. And I'm looking at how our memory might be biased to remembering things about information regarding formidability as well, because it's so important. And then also, you probably noticed that there isn't a lot of research about women in this area, and I've talked about why that's the case. There's a good reason women are less aggressive on average, but that doesn't mean that things like bargaining power are important to women, right? So women were probably not passive agents in the evolutionary past who were just waiting around to have a baby. It's not the way it was. Women also competed for access to resources and mates and status because that would have helped their offspring as well. So it's very likely that other aspects of bargaining power that are not formidability, like intelligence or attractiveness or health or youth, might also relate to women's behavioral strategies. So there's a little bit of research suggesting that that women who are more attractive are more easily angered. So that's some evidence, but there's not a whole lot of evidence about women. So that's a viable option for future inquiry. But basically, my takeaway for this is just that by forming hypotheses about human behavior based on evolutionary theory, we can understand a lot more things that don't really make a lot of sense. So it doesn't really make sense that somebody who's more formidable should be more aggressive without evolutionary theory guiding your judgments of this. So yeah, thanks.